to Inimitable, the podcast brought to you by the Charles Dickens Museum in London. In 1836, Charles Dickens married Catherine Hogarth. They would remain together for 22 years, having 10 children together in the process. But in 1858, the couple separated, and Dickens spent the remainder of his life accusing Catherine of having been an unfit mother, at times mentally unstable, and more generally of being unsuitable to be his wife. For much of history, Dickens was taken at his word, and for over a century, Catherine has been remembered as a largely unhappy figure, simply the jilted wife. However, Dr. Lillian Nayder has begun the work of deconstructing this myth. Her book, The Other Dickens, reveals a woman who is far removed from the betrayal of Catherine by Charles Dickens. This research has been further bolstered by our own recent acquisition of a series of previously unpublished letters by Catherine to her son Plorn. A mere glance at these letters immediately demonstrates a woman who was warm, kind, and loving to her children. So who was the real Catherine Dickens? What was her relationship with Charles Dickens actually like? And how has her story been shaped in the time since her death? To answer these questions, we sat down with Lillian Nayder.
She was from a very cultured family, so I think a lot of people assume that the culture came from her husband, but in fact, her father and her mother were very literate, sort of artistically inclined people. Her father in particular was very involved with the music scene in Edinburgh. She was born in Edinburgh in 1815. In Newtown. So Newtown is sort of the Enlightenment design part of Edinburgh. And that was sort of the ethos of the family. So Enlightenment values, the importance of reason, and that kind of value system was part of how she was raised.
And of course, this is the time, I guess, Edinburgh. Is it still referred to as the Athens of the North?
Absolutely. And that was when Newtown was constructed, was in the 18th century as a result of sort of all of those neoclassical sort of values. And so her father was a legal man. He was a writer to the Signet, and he did some legal work for Sir Walter Scott when Scott got into financial trouble. So he knew Scott, he knew a lot of the sort of literary figures in Edinburgh. Catherine's maternal grandfather, George Thompson, was a sort of almost like a musicologist, and he was involved in the beginnings of the Edinburgh Music Festival.
Wow.
Yeah, and so they had impromptu concerts at the home and all of that.
Lovely.
Yeah,
Did Felix Mendelssohn?
That's right. Felix Mendelssohn stayed with them when Catherine was a teenager, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, and so she really was sort of immersed in that sort of culture in Edinburgh.
Wow, very literate, very musical, cultured, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
And what are her parents raising her for? Is she expected to become a middle-class wife?
Well, I think the assumption was that she would marry and have children, but I think they embraced intellectual endeavors and cultural knowledge. And so there wasn't a big divide in that family, a big gender divide between the way in which the girls were treated and the way in which the boys were treated. I mean, the boys did get a formal education in a way that the girls didn't, but it wasn't as if the girls were being excluded from discussions of culture or musical endeavors. It's pretty clear that Catherine knew how to play the piano and probably took place in the family concerts that they had, with some frequency. So, and she wrote letters, and she was very sort of articulate in her writing as a teenager too. So
wow, so she is being encouraged to think, to be an independent mind almost.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely, yeah, and so you can tell just from the almost like the sentence structure of the letters that she and her sister wrote that they're well read, because I think in the early 19th century that was how people were learning how to write, at least in part, was from everything that they read. And so, her sentences are complex. They have diction that is pretty well developed. And so even though later in her life, Dickens sometimes gave her a hard time about her letters, particularly because of her handwriting, in fact, she had a pretty substantial vocabulary and style and all the rest of it, which I think came from her reading.
Absolutely. And what a childhood then, to think that she's kind of literally meeting figures such as Walter Scott, Felix Mendelssohn. That's quite incredible. So when she's 16, they moved to London, is that right?
Yeah, sometime around that it was around 1830, the early 1830s. First, I think they moved to Exeter, or the father moved to Exeter, and then she was probably in Exeter as well. But then they moved to London. Her father talked about the sort of legal profession being overstocked. I think it became harder and harder for him to support his family as a writer to the Signet, and so he had some literary ambition as well as musical interests. And so he thought if he went to London, he might be able to begin editing, enter the editing world in terms of, newspapers or periodicals. And that's in fact what he ended up doing.
Okay, so that's quite interesting as well, because they are the Hogarth family then. They're clearly well connected and they're quite cultured, but they're not rich. They're sort of looking for money.
Exactly. I mean, they had a big family and it was difficult to support, all of those children on George Hogarth's income. And so, like the Dickenses, like the family of John Dickens, the Hogarths did have money troubles. Yeah, and so that was important, was to find a position that would pay. They didn't have any kind of independent fortune or family money, quote unquote, or any of that. So.
Okay. And so she's this young woman then moving to the big city. Story as old as time in some ways. What do we know about her personality at this time?
She had sort of what we would now probably term girl culture.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most startling things I discovered when I was working on the biography of her was in the British Library, just sort of on a lark, I decided to do a search for a journal of a woman named Mrs. Ayrton, who was the wife of a friend of Catherine's father. Someone who was in the musical world in London. And so I got this handwritten, pretty tiny little journal out of the bowels of the British Library. And I opened it up, and one of the first things I saw was a reference to C and M, which was Catherine and Mary Hogarth, who had come over to her house for basically a pajama party with her daughters.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I could hardly believe my eyes when I opened that dusty little tome up, and there was this amazing reference to Catherine as a teenager, with her sort of younger sister Mary in tow at this basically a sleepover party.
Oh, that's so fun.
Yeah. And so I think, they had a lot of girl friends, and sort of were very lively and witty and Mary and Catherine Hogarth also had a cousin back in Scotland who they wrote to quite a bit, sort of joking letters and comical. And I think they really did have a good time together. Excellent. Yeah. So that gave me a little window into her sort of teenage years.
Lovely. So they're doing really what a lot of teenagers do. They're meeting up with friends.
Without the social media component, but yes. Thankfully for them, no Facebook or all of that stuff.
Nothing to come back and haunt them later.
Exactly.
Just a few letters to find.
Exactly.
So how does Catherine meet Charles Dickens?
They meet through Catherine's father, because Dickens is starting to publish sketches and starting to contribute to newspapers and with the sketches and stuff like that. And so he meets George Hogarth through the Chronicle, the daily paper. And George Hogarth sort of invites him over, and he comes over and does all this sort of funny stuff. He dresses up as a sailor and does this sort of weird hornpipe thing and meets the family and, invites Catherine to a birthday party of his when I think he turns 21 or something like that. Maybe it was 23, but his early 20s. He invites her to this birthday party, and I think things just sort of take off from there. And so they're engaged in 1835, and they get married in 1836. But his courtship of her is sort of interesting. He was sort of gradually setting the terms of their relationship, and he had been sort of scorned by Maria Beadnell, and so he did not want a repeat of that, and he definitely wanted to sort of have the upper hand in their relationship. And so, having been sort of more at her sort of her own direction, in terms of what she did and what she said and how she ran her life, they sort of entered into this bit of a power struggle in the first couple months of their courtship and engagement. And it became clear that he didn't want to be messed with. He didn't want her to get into a huff if she wasn't happy about something. And the biggest bone of contention was his work hours. I mean, he was already sort of a workaholic. He had a lot of deadlines to meet. And so she would sort of get in a huff about that. And he made it clear to her that this was for her good as well as for his good. And she was going to have to, learn to accept the way in which he was conducting his life. It was a bit of a threat, basically. There's a letter where he says, if you don't like this, tell me now, and we can just end this whole thing. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but he made it clear to her that, if she couldn't accept this, their relationship wasn't going to work out.
So that was really red lines.
Yes, he definitely had some red lines. I think because he had been so wounded by this earlier relationship, and he was not going to go back and go through any of that again.
And presumably we don't really know what Catherine thought when she receives that letter.
I think it surprised her. I mean, I think what she learned is that she was going to be playing a subordinate role. I mean, I think that was being made pretty clear to her. So she accepted that, And
I suppose it's that question, isn't it, of would that have been the case no matter who she married? Or do you think Dickens was more controlling than most other Victorians?
I think Dickens was more controlling. Okay. I mean, there was a huge range of sort of husbandly behavior, and I think some husbands really did treat their wives more as equal. I would say more equal.
Right.
I mean, there was so much built into not just English culture, but English law that transformed wives into a version of property. And so some men sort of questioned that, and other men used it to their own benefit.
Of course.
And I mean, in Dickens' own circle, William Charles Macready, he had his sister spend about a year sort of educating his wife-to-be for marriage. She was a lot younger, Kitty Macready. I think her birth name was Atkins. Macready felt like his sister needed to spend an extended amount of time preparing this fiancée of his for marriage.
Gosh.
Almost like Pygmalion, and the Pygmalion story. They didn't go through, Catherine and Charles did not go through that. But on the other hand, they didn't have an equal sort of marriage. And I mean, Catherine's own father was different, I think, was more equitable in his thinking about gender than Dickens was. Dickens was sort of probably somewhere in the middle ground as far as attitudes toward gender difference, sexual difference. I mean, that's how they were thinking about it, obviously, was a sexual difference.
Of course, yeah. And actually that probably would have been, to say the least, an adjustment for Catherine if she's been raised by a fairly progressive father to think and be independent, to then have to accept that when she marries Dickens, that's not going to be the case.
Right. I mean, of course, Catherine's own mother was primarily responsible for maintaining their house, raising the children. I mean, it wasn't like she marched off to the office and was making money herself. So it's not, but I think George Hogarth's attitude toward women was not that women couldn't think, or that they were limited by their physiology, or that there were necessarily these really significant essential differences between men and women. I think he questioned all of that, which was really built into sort of 19th century culture. And so I think that sort of sets him apart from a lot of the men that Catherine would come to know in later life, not just her husband, but lots of other men in their circle.
And do we know this? I mean, I don't know where you'd find the information, but maybe you do. Do we know what attracts Catherine to Dickens? Why did she choose him?
He chose her,
Big
first of all.
That's a very
I
big
think,
distinction.
you have to remember about like who's got the prerogative to propose and to choose. Women can say yes or no. I mean, she could make it clear that she was interested. There were ways of signaling that, within sort of proper constraints, because Catherine was definitely a proper, young woman. She wasn't going to do anything unusual in terms of, showing her own feelings or whatever. But I mean, it's sort of the ball is in his court in terms of, marriage proposals and all the rest of it. I mean, women have some power before they're engaged. But once they're engaged, they're sort of in training for marriage, at the hands of their fiancés. So I think what attracted her to Dickens, I mean, he was attractive physically, energetic and sprightly, and had wavy brown hair, and seemed sort of fit. He did a lot of walking, and all the rest of it. And he was funny. I mean, he was really engaging, had a very sort of unique and unusual sense of humor. I think he was very smart and very clever, very winning. He was a very winning person as a young man in his early 20s. I mean, he was also sort of a go-getter, he really wanted to succeed. Success was very important to him. So I think he was really sort of an attractive package.
Sure, yeah, it's not hard to see where you'd fall for someone like that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a bit, because you mentioned there that Catherine is a proper young woman, and the Hogarth family are probably, I know they have money troubles, but in terms of social class, they're a cut above the Dickens family. Do we know anything about Catherine's sort of role in those early years of their family? Because I always imagine that Catherine would have had to almost teach Dickens how to be a middle-class family.
Well, it's funny because, I mean, the Dickenses were middle class originally. I mean, John Dickens worked in the Navy Pay Office, and he earned his annual salary was in certain years well above £400 a year.
Wow.
Yeah. So he actually had a pretty good solid middle class income, if not even a bit higher than your usual middle class income in the early decades of the 19th century. It's just that he was a terrible money manager. I mean, he's overspent his income, and he may even have sort of co-signed for some debts. I mean, there's some sort of discussion about how exactly he got into so much money trouble. It may not have just been his overspending. He may have signed for other people's debts or something like that. But in any case, originally they were sort of solidly middle class, the Dickenses. And so even though the Hogarths had sort of some greater cultural sort of contacts and that kind of thing, it's not like the Dickenses were working class, or it's not like they were even lower middle class. Dickens's grandparents worked on an estate, and so apparently his paternal grandfather was a steward or a butler, and his paternal grandmother was a housekeeper for an aristocrat of some kind. But despite that, they were certainly middle class. And then, John Dickens got into all that money trouble. But that was a fall. That was a fall. It wasn't that they were in any way impoverished at the start.
And didn't know how to behave or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so it wasn't like a misalliance, or it wasn't like they were coming from different social classes. I think Catherine came from a very literary and sort of cultured family, but they didn't have any sort of upper class pretensions or anything like that. I mean, they knew Sir Walter Scott, but things were a little bit different in Scotland too, I think, in terms of the way that the sort of culture worked. And so in any case, I mean, Dickens had the sort of shame of his father's having been imprisoned for debt. There's been recent scholarship showing that George Hogarth himself may well have been imprisoned for debt for periods of time.
So again, actually, in many ways, they actually almost have quite similar, very similar.
That's right.
Stories.
I think that was later. That was, when maybe in the 1840s or something like that. Or it was a bit later than Dickens's sort of 12-year-old experience, having to go to work when he was 12 because of his father's imprisonment for debt.
But certainly, you can imagine Catherine and Charles would have, actually really supported each other through that. If you think that they've got those shared experiences.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think Catherine would have been put off by the idea that Dickens's father had been imprisoned for debt. I don't think that was in any way sort of the sort of off-putting thing that it apparently was for Maria Beadnell or Maria Beadnell's family. Her father was, I think, a banker or something like that, and I think Dickens was sort of not considered a legitimate suitor because of his father's financial troubles. But that wouldn't have been an issue for the Hogarths. They didn't care that much about money. They needed money to survive. They wanted money to sort of live their lives. But I don't think they would have thought of debt as a source of shame.
In the way that others did.
And the way in which others did. So I think they were more open-minded than that.
Yeah. Tell us a bit then, fairly quickly after Catherine's marriage to Charles Dickens, he's then catapulted to international fame, not least when they're living here at Doughty Street, and he writes Oliver Twist. What impact would all of that have on Catherine? How would that change sort of her position and her life when now that she's married to this incredibly famous literary man?
Right. Well, I think just in terms of the material details of life, living in a place like this, having a staff of servants, because eventually, even at Doughty Street, I think they had 3 or 4 servants that they were maintaining sort of on their staff. So the Hogarths might have had one sort of maid of all work in their household who sort of helped to scrub the floors and, the grate and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, at Doughty Street, she was living a completely different kind of life. I mean, the servants alone, that was a major class marker. Living here with that staff of servants, that was really a mark of their ascension in terms of class and their affluence. They'd sort of made it. Because her husband had made it, she too had made it. I mean, her social identity was defined by her husband's from that point on. And, she was a domestic manager, and she wasn't herself doing all the work that the servants performed. They had someone who was cooking meals. They had, a maidservant who was doing a lot of the cleaning. And so that in itself makes a big difference in somebody's life.
And it must have been, we think a lot when people think of the Victorian era. You think of society, of the dinner parties and the London season and all that kind of that Downton Abbey style fun. But presumably Catherine's going to all of that. Presumably she's being invited to dinners and parties and kind of.
And they hosted parties. I mean, they hosted plenty of parties here. They had holiday parties and dinner parties and all of that. And so, I mean, she's suddenly brought into new social circles and invited to evenings out. Of course, she also starts having children. Even before she moves to Doughty Street, she's got Charlie. So they move here, and Charlie's a baby. And then in 1838, she gives birth to Mamie. So she's starting to have children. And that, too, is defining what her life is like. So it's, it's a different role for her now that she's a mother. So that, too, she's a wife, she's a mother. And so, in and of itself, those are major changes for her.
Of course.
Yeah,
very much so. And we talk a lot about the fame of Charles Dickens. But is she famous? You know, if she walks into a shop, are people going to nudge themselves and say, oh, that's Mrs. Dickens?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I mean, certainly when they went on their American tour, she would have been, you know, a sort of, not exactly the celebrity, but she would certainly be identified as the wife of Charles Dickens on the street or, you know, at various events or talks and all the rest of it. I think, you know, that might have been a moment where she was pointed out as the wife of Charles Dickens. I'm not sure that would have happened in London before 1842 when they went to America. But I mean, when they went to America, a lot of Americans, particularly the Bostonians, thought Catherine was a lady.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. They talked about her seeming more of the lady than Charles did the gentleman.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There are some interesting sort of American journals where people are drawing these distinctions between her sort of vulgar husband and then the lady like Catherine, who really knew how to conduct herself.
That's really interesting.
Oh, yes,
yeah, quite revealing in terms of their personalities. You know, you mentioned that she's a very proper young woman.
Absolutely.
Perhaps Dickens is more pushing the boundaries of what he should and shouldn't do.
He's definitely saying things that were construed as inappropriate.
Okay.
I think he described a woman he knew in London as kissable or something like that and raised a lot of eyebrows.
Shockingly vulgar.
Shockingly, whereas Catherine would have kept her mouth shut.
But quite an extraordinary moment, though, for Catherine to think that for a young woman who came from, you know, a family in Scotland that's well connected but fairly humble in terms of their financial income, to suddenly kind of be going on these international trips where she's got a bit of spotlight and she's kind of seen as quite famous again. That's quite a heady moment in her life.
But I don't think she wanted the spotlight.
Okay.
Yeah, she was not someone who craved spotlight.
So they probably suited quite well, actually, because I think Dickens probably loved the spotlight.
He wanted center stage. Absolutely. She was happy to be in the wing.
And tell us more then about Catherine's circle of her family, her friends, the people that she's interacting with kind of on a regular basis. What does that tell us about her?
Yeah, so many of her closest sort of connections were family members. So she was close to her mother. She was very close to her sister Mary, who tragically died at Doughty Street, you know, in 1837. And so that was a terrible turn of events. But she was close to others in her family. She was close to her cousin, who she didn't really see much after her marriage, but they did correspond. You know, as a new mother, Catherine wrote to her cousin in Scotland about how beautiful her child Charlie was, you know, as a baby, and how much she was sort of enraptured with him and that kind of thing. She was very close to certain of the wives in their social circle. So Kitty Macready was a very good example. She also had friends from her girlhood or friends from her teenage years. So Eliza Franklin was a friend who she had made in Exeter before her marriage. And so Eliza Franklin came to visit the Dickenses at Doughty Street after Catherine had married Charles. So she had some old friends too, older friends. And then Catherine was really interested in music still. And so when Dickens first met Christiana Weller, I think it was he was giving a public speech in Manchester, and met Christiana Weller, who was sort of really on the rise as a pianist. Catherine befriended her. They actually became quite close friends for a number of years. And Christiana Weller ended up marrying Dickens's friend T.J. Thompson.
Okay, so they're in this little sort of circle.
And they were all in Lausanne at the same time when Dickenses were living in Switzerland for a while. And Catherine spent a lot of time with Christiana Weller, then Christy Thompson at the time. Yeah, and in fact, Dickens's brother Fred married the younger sister of Christiana Thompson.
Wow.
So yes, it was sort of a sort of little family circle.
Yeah, and shows how close they are, I guess, that their families are all mixing and meeting and falling in love with each other.
Exactly. And Dickens disapproved of his brother Fred's marrying Anna Weller. He thought the Wellers puffed up their daughters too much. and that, they were sort of had great expectations that were sort of unrealistic and inappropriate. And Dickens really sort of eventually he balked at a lot of that.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
In terms of what Catherine's getting up to, and we'll come on later in the show about kind of the darker side of the relationship, but some of the accusations that Dickens makes against Catherine, I think sometimes people have this perception that she's a bit of a doormat, that she's kind of not really doing very much, but then actually she's taking part in theatrical productions, she's clearly friends with musicians. So could you just tell us a bit more about, I guess, what she's getting up to in this part?
Sure. I mean, I think you have to remember too that she's got these household responsibilities. One of the things that I got into were the banking records.
Oh, really interesting.
So Dickens had opened his account at Coutts Bank in the late 1830s. I think he opened in 1837 when he was living at Doughty Street. And if you go through those banking records, what you realize is that he's channeling quite a bit of money to Catherine. So in terms of the sort of cash flow, you can put together part of her role as household manager by following the money stream. And I got into that in part because there were all these claims that once they got into later in the 1840s and the 1850s, Georgina Hogarth, who lived with the Dickenses, was the one who was really running the household. What the banking records revealed was, in fact, Georgina was on an allowance, a very small allowance, as opposed to Catherine, who was getting a lot of the household money to run the show. And so that was sort of enlightening in terms of setting the record straight.
Well, that's so right, because actually you do, even now you hear people talking about the fact that Catherine didn't really run the home and Dickens took over a lot of those roles, but you're saying actually that's not the case.
That's right. I mean, you can see in the checkbook record that he was paying the servants as opposed to Catherine, but there are a lot of payments to Catherine that are obviously meant for household expenses and for shopping and for, household goods and all of that. So she certainly had a lot more of the household cash than Georgina ever did.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
And of course, it's such an interesting point to talk about her role as the house manager, because I think it's so easy in the modern world to kind of almost sneer at the idea of, they were just a Victorian housewife. But you think actually, if you're running a team of, 4 or 5 servants, you've got provisions to order, you've got wages to pay. So you're running a business, really, even though it's your home, in terms of your savviness and your intellect, you have to be able to run a business.
Well, also to Dickens, entertaining was really important. I mean, even at Doughty Street, I mean, I think at Gad's Hill, Tavistock House, his sort of entertainments are very well recorded, but there were plenty of entertainments here at Doughty Street. And in the early 1850s, she wrote a cookbook. It's actually bills of fare, so menu planning, what we would consider menu planning. But there are some recipes in an appendix in that book, so it's clear that she was responsible for, planning and organizing some pretty lavish entertainments for lots of dinner parties involving often, a dozen people or something like that. And so she was definitely thinking about how to put on a successful party.
And as the person who does events here at the museum, I can sympathize. That's a lot of work.
It is, I'm sure, a lot of work.
So I've plucked a date out of random. So I've said in 1845, Catherine was 30 years old. And at that point in her life, she's married to the most famous man pretty much on the planet. She's got 6 children. She's got a lovely London townhouse at that point near Kensington Palace, because of course they'd moved out of Doughty Street by that point. It seems like she's in quite an enviable position. Reflecting on where she came from in her early life, what do you think Catherine would have been thinking at this point, 1845, when she's 30 years old?
I think she's thinking about her children. She's thinking about how her children are doing, and are they happy, and who's with them at what times. And I think, her role as mother was sort of front and center. And so I would think that she would be thinking about this household of children. I mean, they're also, I think, in that year, getting ready for a trip to Italy. So I think she's also thinking about where they're going next. I think it's hard with a household full of children to be relocating.
Of course.
And so I think that took a lot of thought and planning. And so I think, she's definitely enjoying life. I mean, they've got this active social life. They go to the theater a lot. I think she was fond of going to the opera. And so they're very sort of socially active. But again, she's got a household full of children who she really is close to and focused on their well-being. And so,
that's lovely. So
yeah.
It's a busy household, hectic. I think a lot of people would probably know what that feels like. But happy, that's a really nice...
Yeah, I think she was very happy.
It has been fascinating to get this glimpse into Catherine's life, both of her early years and the first half of her marriage. It's already pretty clear that Dickens's later attempts to portray Catherine as a bad mother and an unfit wife were wholly untrue. Catherine was clearly adept both at being a society hostess and as a mother. Yet this was a happiness which was not destined to last. So what went wrong in the Dickens marriage? And how did this couple, clearly so happy and in love, come to a point of disillusionment, restlessness and scandal? Find out in our next episode.